Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion Implementing a Multi-Cloud Strategy, sponsored by VMware on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Tom Sasela, the Director of the Army Operations and Architecture in the Office of CIO G6, Daniel Corbin, the Chief Technology Advisor for C4 Headquarters in the U.S. Marine Corps, Randy Conway, the Deputy CIO for Information Enterprise in the Defense Department, Larry Reed, the Assistant Director for Security Operations at the Justice Department, and Bill Rowan, the Vice President of Federal for VMware. Now, right before break, Tom and Bill brought up this idea of these second-order changes, third-order changes. I'm sure there's more. And Daniel, as Bill was talking and Tom was talking, your head was definitely shaking. Yes, yes, yes. So talk a little bit about what the Marine Corps is seeing and what you're looking at from that perspective.
Yeah, so a couple items that he mentioned, there is the potential for cost savings that many are starting to see. I don't know how much in the DoD that's starting to occur, but there's clear savings to be had, even though that is not the primary objective. The reality is that we have to be able to start providing infrastructure to give money back so that we can get capability back specifically to the warfighter. Some of the other second-order effects that we are starting to look at is as we take the savings in people, and that's where a significant amount of that is when you get cloud services, is in the human capital aspect. A concern is that as we outsource these types of things, how much do you need to keep organic to the organization to be able to even buy it again the next go-around and then operate it? So that would be something that we are very interested in and concerned about as we start to buy things as a service, take the efficiencies in people, and then be able to continue to operate under that model.
In many ways, the Marine Corps maybe learned the hard lesson, or in the Navy and the Marine Corps did, I guess, with NMCI, is you maybe outsourced a little bit too much, and then you saw the Marine Corps really pull it back in. It's the same thing, same concern here with cloud, or is it? Am I making apples and oranges?
That's exactly right. There's an analogy there under the. I assume you're talking about NMCI, where both the Navy and the Marine Corps outsourced that for all the right reasons, and then we lost a great deal of the competency of running an enterprise network. We're doing a good job now, but it's been taking a while to ramp back up to get that skill set back in place.
And Randy, let me turn to you. Is that a part of the concern that DoD at large has of how do you make sure you find the right balance? Because as decisions are made about what types of cloud to go to, you may get Tom saying we only want to go to a government-only cloud, and you may have Daniel saying, well, we only want to go commercial, but there's got to be a happy medium, right? And that's part of the discussion.
Yeah, it's a risk. There's a risk calculus here in terms of what's your comfort level, and I happen to agree with the Marine Corps and the Army, I guess, in this sense, is that you got to have a trained workforce to do IT. You can't just be in this mindset that outsourcing it is going to solve my problems, and you just kind of wash away all the other problems. All it does is add more problems because it's far too complex. When you get into the applications and the systems that go into the cloud, then someone's got to understand how it all works together. There is an impact on how the cloud, how a cloud service, how it impacts the larger wide area networking architecture that we have in the department for NIPRNet and SIPRNet. And we have to be careful that whatever we do within that cloud, it has to work with our larger architecture design. And sometimes when you go with the total outsource, you just kind of assume that it's just going to work fine with the larger architecture. And what we learned with some pilots that we've done in the last year or so is that is not the case at all. It has a significant impact on how network addressing translation occurs and how that impacts our multi-protocol label switching boxes that have virtual routing forward capability, VRFs, and how VRFs are affected by natting. And so
I thought Daniel was killing me with the acronyms.
Well,
Good job.
The natting is probably one. The network address translation and how that works is very complicated.
Tom approves, by the way. You got it right.
But the thing is, it has an impact on the larger network. And so if you're in this mindset that outsourcing and you're just going to outsource it, and you're putting all your trust and confidence in the cloud service provider to just make it all work for you, that's really not going to happen in your favor. Okay, we're learning that in some cases the hard way. But getting back into your original question there about how you decide what type of a cloud you want. Well, Like, for example, the mission, the system that you're trying to put in there, the application you're trying to put into the cloud is going to dictate largely what you're trying to do. Because, like, for example, if you have a classified system, secret, for example, well, then that's private, and that's going to be a whole different design. The cloud service providers are very limited into who is qualified to do that for you. So now you're kind of necking it down into there's only going to be 1 or 2 people that can actually do that for you. If you're on our non-secure network, there's instances where you need to be at impact level 4 or impact level 5. And so you've got to understand, do you want it to be private, or do you want it to be public, or something in between? And there's a big debate going on right now about how private do you want it to be, because the more private you get, the more costly the cloud service provider is going. There's a cost burden, okay? And so somewhere you're going to pay the cost. And it's either on our side, the infrastructure side for the department, where we would pay the cost, or it's on their side where they would pay the cost to make it more private. And so we just gotta, there's a sort of a business case analysis that you have to do to figure out what's best for you. There's a lot of people that think that that cloud is going to reap all these savings benefits, but when you look at it deeply and dig into it, you say, well, there's cost somewhere. So are you just shifting cost to some other part of the department's bill, or do you really think you're making a savings? Ultimately, you would think that there's some kind of a savings with this, but not necessarily. You know, it has to get proven out. And then there's the thing that the Army says, though, but we're all about being effective. It's about being effective, okay? Not necessarily trying to save money all the time. How can we make our warfighting capability more effective? And sometimes there's a bill to pay just to be more effective. So anyway, I would say that there's a big decisions that go into this, and there's a lot of pressure for you to make a decision quickly, but you really got to take the time to look into it to make sure that what you're doing makes sense for your system, your application, and your service.
Tom, jump in.
So I just want to make one comment. Effectivity is something that we want to certainly look at, but there's an aspect that many of the government service providers and government entities need to grapple with, which is survivability and reliability, right? So certainly Microsoft wants their cloud environment to be reliable, right? Not to pick on Microsoft, but any of the vendors want their cloud environment to be reliable. But the reality comes in when you're in a warfighting arena, if your solution is not completely reliable and not completely survivable in a contested environment, whether that's kinetic or non-kinetic contesting of the environment, right? That's a real problem. And so weapon systems, in many cases in the Department of Defense, spend years under development and testing to make sure that they are very survivable in the most harsh conditions. There's a real danger, and the Marine Corps faces this a lot, right? As you're forward deployed in your expeditionary nature, you cannot rely on systems that have a reach back to the quote-unquote cloud because it's just not a reliable, sustainable environment. And so to Randy's point, there's a premium that we have to pay to protect our warfighters, right? And that is something that we will do. And so there may be cost savings by moving to the cloud, but it might be washed out by the additional resiliency and survivability that we need to make the environment more effective.
No, Bill, jump in real quick, because as Randy was talking about it, the thing I thought of was the customization of COTS, right? You take it off the shelf, you customize it, you lose all your savings. I know you're probably not going that direction, but how?
There's 2 points. So to that area, I think it's important to keep in mind, for the most part, what we've done is move legacy applications. And legacy may be a term of 3 years versus 10, 15 years. We've moved them to the cloud. Those applications were never designed in the first place with a cloud architecture in mind. And to Tom's point he's making here is the Marines can't afford to have that disconnected. Of course, that app wasn't ever built with that concept in mind. So as we modernize those applications, we resolve some of those issues. We have the potential to resolve some of those issues. I think back to one of the other areas that Randy touched upon, which we see on a constant basis, is there will be the need to look at our tactics, techniques, and procedures inside of all agencies. We've worked under the premise that Well, when I leave the room, if the app is still running, I'm not paying anything different. I kind of harken back to my mother saying, turn the lights off when you leave the room. There's going to be the need for agencies to learn when I'm not using the application, I need to shut it down, I need to log off. Otherwise, that clicker, that counter, that electrical bill, if you will, is still running. And so where an agency thought it might be saving money, doing something more efficient, it may be surprised at the bills it sees at the end of the period, because the mindset of the way we run and work with those applications is changing, and so we have to change the process and procedures of how we use those systems. And it's sometimes it's an important aspect that gets lost until the first couple bills roll in and, hey, what happened here? Well, how come that's so much?
That's a great point. I think people don't realize that, like electricity, if you lights on, you're being charged something, and if you don't shut down that app, that's a fascinating point. Larry, let me turn to you because I want to shift the conversation a little bit to security now, because security plays a role in this effectiveness and the scalability and the reliability. And since you have the title of security operations, when you guys are looking at the cloud, talk a little bit about the security piece. We know it's FedRAMP. We know that's important. We know from a DoD perspective, its impact levels 4, 5, 6, and high baseline. How is Justice looking at the security piece?
So the approach in general is very similar to what Randall said earlier about by looking at the impact level, so FIPS high, low, moderate, and how we want to go about that, along with some of the classified environments, whether we want to look at those or not. But we kind of start there and figure out what the requirements are for the security of it. Where it gets more interesting and challenging is when we start looking at the hybrid environments, whether it be Microsoft and Amazon, or Microsoft and on-prem, or some other combination of other providers that we're looking at. And how do you have the same understanding of risk across those deployed applications as they're in there? And I think, again, back to when Randall was talking earlier about the architecture and fitting into the network architecture, I think that's about to be a big piece of that, is making sure you're building the infrastructure, or at least transitioning your infrastructure in a way that supports the migration to the cloud, whether it be on-prem or in a cloud service provider environment. We've put a lot of effort into that over the last couple of years at Justice in terms of making sure we get the right security from our tech stack as we're moving data into the cloud, and then the right security on the outside of the cloud as non-internal users are accessing it, and what that all looks like. Tying that together in a multi or a hybrid environment is pretty tricky.
You brought up a very interesting point about making sure everybody understands risk the same way. Mm-hmm. How do you do that? Because and we're going to bring Bill in here in a sec, because we can blame you guys for not understanding risk sometimes. But how do you ensure? Can't just be SLAs, right? Service level agreements.
Right. No, it's a lot more than that, right? Because with the shared security model of the cloud service providers, you have to look at the whole picture. One of the transitions for us that's in that is, as we try to combine the security risk that's defined in the SLA with the security risk that our data is exposed to outside of that, which is not something the cloud service provider controls necessarily. Getting that into one picture has been a bit of a challenge. As we go to platform and software as a service, our security metrics have to change as well. The traditional, are you patched, and what's your patch life cycle and that kind of thing doesn't really apply anymore, because you're addressing that through the SLA, and a lot of times you don't even have the visibility into that depending on the contract. And I think that actually goes back to the second order effect, right? As we're moving technical people off running the infrastructure, we need to be adding the acquisition folks onto that so that we can get the right SLAs in place and deal with that. But it's a pretty big challenge.
Sorry. Bill, jump in real quick. We're going to blame you for not understanding the metrics.
Well, I think that it's an interesting dynamic, because agencies and commercial entities, for that matter, inside of government, we have information assurance people who have been looked and monitoring what we're doing to ensure that we're working under the proper security protocols. Yet in a cloud environment, you have some cloud providers who are updating or patching their software, could be daily, could be hourly in many respects. And so when we look at the downstream impact, to Larry's point, some of that's captured in the SLA, some of it's not. And then the question becomes, how worried do we have to be about that, or how much of a positive impact, how much of a reduction of risk might it present, and balancing that to the side of, well, can we accept that? Is that good, prudent business or mission effectiveness? I think that one of the other interesting aspects we see that's coming along this security aspect is, we see that agency employees are doing whatever they possibly can to be effective. You know, we talk about it in some cases, we talk about shadow IT, where organizations or people will get frustrated because they can't get a service that they think they need to complete their mission. And so as a result, what have they done? They've gone out and bought cloud services on an impact card, or you have organizations doing development activities with one provider that may be diametrically opposed to what the agency CIO and CTO are trying to affect. And how do we bring those pieces together to ensure that that doesn't create an asymmetric threat to the network at the same time? So it's an interesting shifting model that I'm certain maybe we probably won't solve it here today, but it's going to be a constantly shifting piece, and it's good news is it's probably full employment for all of us who want it, because it's going to present a real challenge for years to come.
All right. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we can continue our security conversation. We can bring in mobile devices and some of the other things that are kind of disrupting this idea of security. But first, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to the panel discussion, Implementing a Multi-Cloud Strategy, sponsored by VMware on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.